Hey guys, it's Chris Truitt from the Reluctant Somm. We're really excited about Season 3. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for listening. Just wanted to give another little note that if you like what we're doing and you want to show us some support, reviews, likes, shares, word of mouth, all of these things really help us. We'll also be creating a newsletter this year that focuses on some of our favorite restaurants, favorite wine lists, favorite places to eat, as well as just some really cool people in the industry, as well as some other insights into what's going on in our field of profession. I also wanted to let you know that on that is where we'll be updating everybody on all of our pop-ups and any collaboration events or anything that we're doing. So if you want to keep track of us, that's the best way. Also, if you're not already following us on Instagram, you can follow us at Reluctant Somm on Instagram and keep up with us. Give us likes. Cheers. Cool.
Cheers.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
I am excited to have you here. This is something that I feel like we've been talking about for months. It's hard to believe that I started the podcast in May and it's already January. So I'm happy to have you here. I mean, for many reasons, but you and I have known each other now for over 2 years, probably 2.5 years or so.
Okay.
And you, I think, have been maybe fighting against the tide for quite a long time in the project that you've taken on at Roaming Goat in the Marina wine bar that focuses on Georgian Armenian wine, Caucasus Mountain wines, kind of, let's say, Eastern European wines, to make it more digestible for the layman like me. And so yeah, I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited for you to help share some of your information and also kind of like get to know more about you from before you and I met, because we've like loosely talked about it, but it's nice to always sit down in a format like this.
Of course.
So, you know the deal.
Awesome. So I run the wine program. I'm the manager and the sommelier at Roaming Goat in Kauhalo. Our list kind of tells the story of wines starting in the Caucasus in Georgia and Armenia, and then follows like its progression through the southern Mediterranean. And so we focus on island wines. We focus on wines from coastal regions and in kind of Spain, Italy, France, and the greater Mediterranean region. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then before the wine bar, like kind of what's your background? I know kind of you're from the central U.S. Has wine always been, I think we talked about this, wine has kind of been part of your life from the time that you were young, but do you want to elaborate on kind of like how you got introduced to wine and when you decided that it's kind of what you want to focus on as a means of living?
Yeah, I guess I kind of initially got in wine through food. My family took me to Spain in like 99, and we spent a good part of the summer there. And I first went to Muga and had a really good experience with a little bit of chorizo and a little bit of Rioja. But then it was not till college that I really kind of started initially getting into wine. I went to college in Portland, Oregon, and I met a couple of people whose parents owned wineries or were directly involved in wineries in Napa and Sonoma. And so once I graduated, I ended up moving down to Napa, and I worked first actually at Rombauer in their tasting room, but then at a couple of other smaller wineries in the area, Honig, and actually Silver Oaks, larger winery. And that was kind of my first introduction kind of into the wine scene. I got to kind of know the difference in AVAs and, you know, how important it was to make single vineyard wines and all that kind of stuff. And that kind of led me down the road into what I'm doing now today.
And that's cool. I guess I didn't realize that you worked at those wineries. I mean, I think, you know, that it's important for people to have experience working with like some form of a larger company at some point in their career, whether it's like whatever. I mean, I used to work for Southern Glazers, and I used to sell Barefoot, and I used to work for Landry's Corporation for restaurants. You know, there's a lot of like great core things that you can learn from those places that probably get drilled into a little bit more than they need to, but you don't really forget them as easy. When you were working kind of throughout those wineries, was it thinking about what the next step was, or were you kind of there and then another opportunity came about and you kind of moved to that place? Or did you like kind of have like a trajectory like where you wanted to go?
Yeah, I guess at that point, I didn't even know I was working in the wine industry. I was kind of doing it as a job for the most part. And it really wasn't until I had a friend of mine suggest that I take my sommelier examination, and I passed it kind of without studying, that I really realized that I was like headed down that road.
Guess I'm doing this.
Yeah, exactly. But it was a long progression for me. Like, I then moved to Oakland, and I was working in wine shops. I eventually ended up managing the tasting room at a winery, Rockwall Winery in Alameda.
That's right.
And got into sales for a while as well. And I always had a passion for food and wine, but I'd never really thought that it was going to be like my long-term, I guess, career path. But eventually, I committed to it, and here we are today.
Yeah. And in the 2.5 years that you've been at Roaming Goat, I feel like the concept has been kind of outlined from the beginning, but how much change do you think has kind of taken place over seeing what works, what doesn't work? Or have you kind of just like bullheaded your way into like making it work? Because what you're doing is successful, and it's not something that somebody was doing in the area before. So, maybe elaborate on the amount of work that it took to teach the marina to maybe be excited about wines that weren't Sancerre or California wines.
Yeah, so I think initially when I first started this project, we had a general idea that we wanted to show off some wines from the Caucasus, but initially we wanted to do like 25% domestic wines. We wanted to do classic European wines and some Caucasian wines, right? But I found out very early on, establishing relationships with my customer base, that we could really do whatever I wanted to do, as long as you could tell the story and like really connect with them. And like that's been a big part of what has made us successful at Roaming Goat. And I think kind of in this post-COVID,
Just go forward a little bit more. Sorry.
Yeah, of course. This post-COVID kind of new wave of wine bars it's really just finding wines that you can talk about, tell the story for, and connect with your customer base on. And I think that's the most important part. There's this whole wave of natural wines, and that's been so successful, and they've been able to tell their own story. And I take the other path where we do, more traditional styles of wines, but that are equally, or in my opinion, more relevant, and we tell their story, and we've been incredibly successful doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you're right? Like, people are much more interested in talking about and drinking things that they feel some connection to or some emotional connection to, right? And by being able to tell the story and being able to express kind of like the dreams or the idealism of the wineries, I think is really a way to like break through to the customer base, especially I feel like with a category of wine that doesn't get nearly as much coverage as it probably should, right? Being, Eastern European wines. Do you think that you're kind of in the space where you want to be, or over the next year or 2 years, are you going to try to drill it down even tighter, or kind of like percentage wise, like where do you think you're at kind of in the completion chapter, I guess?
I think it's complicated right now. I mean, the upcoming tariffs obviously are going to have a huge impact on what we're doing. So I did a lot of buying last year, kind of understanding that the price of wine is probably going to go up in the upcoming years. But I mean, I'm happy with where we're at. We're still in, I guess I would say, a growth period in the wine list. I would like to see us add 100 more wines by the end of the year. But everything that I add to the list is hand curated. I have to do many hours of research in order to add a particular wine, unless I have a relationship with someone like you that can bring me an interesting wine.
Sure.
Right. So yeah, I probably see us expanding more in the Eastern Peninsula this year in particular, in Slovenian wines, in Croatian wines, and I am planning hopefully another trip to Armenia to hopefully make some deals and get some additional Armenian imports as well.
Yeah.
But we'll see.
That's awesome. And so you brought up another trip to Armenia. And so I kind of one of the big things that I wanted to talk about in this podcast was your trip to Armenia and kind of what that looked like. And you had been studying the region for 1.5 years, 2 years almost already at that point, and then going there. I mean, how much of an eye-opening experience was it? Or was it very similar to kind of what you were expecting, and then kind of like maybe expand upon like what it's like being in that region with those people?
Yeah, so I honestly didn't know what to expect going in because there's very little literature on what's going on in the Armenian scene. There's like maybe 2 books published, and they're each less than 100 pages.
More like a catalog.
More like a little catalog, exactly. And so what I didn't understand going there, because my initial understanding was that Armenia, and Georgia were the 2 oldest wine-producing regions in the world. And what I really didn't understand was that Armenia is both the oldest and the youngest wine-producing region in the world. The average vine age of like modern trading system, double GO, in Viat Zor in southern Armenia is about 7 years old right now.
Wow.
And so that means they have had this really complicated negotiation system with the villagers that kind of like tended vines for hundreds of years. And they're this wild old vine, bush vine. And it's been a very like complicated system that they have in place. And so they have a mix, of old vine and young vine, but they're trying to transition into modern winemaking techniques. And they kind of have this really, I guess, unique position compared to Georgia. And a little bit of backstory to this. So the Ottoman Empire came into Armenia and invaded them pre-World War I. And they were controlled by the Ottomans and weren't producing any wine up until the Ottoman Empire disbanded post-World War I. And the USSR ended up taking them over as a territory. During that time, the Russians had the Georgians producing wine for them because Stalin was actually from Georgia. And it was his home country, and he had a preference for their style of wine. And because of that, the Armenians were producing brandy during that time. And so it was several hundred years that the Armenians actually weren't producing any wine at all. And so the place that the Armenians find themselves in now is they're in a very unique position to kind of forge their own path within the wine world. They get to create styles that they want to create with grapes that are from their own country, right? And the Georgians are more kind of tied towards their like classic ancient style of winemaking. And so Armenians are using, modern techniques with ancient grapes to make these really kind of amazing, unique modern wines.
I mean, it's crazy to think that like a place that's been growing grapes as long as they have and has so much history of making wine is just in its infancy of like maybe let's say the craft winemaking movement, right?
Yep.
Because if you were producing brandy, it would maybe be a little less about terroir and maybe a little bit more about production volume.
Yep.
Do you see, I mean, from what I understand, Armenia specifically is a relatively like high elevation appellation. Well, the appellation that they're growing in, right? What's it like up there? I mean, is there snow melt? Is there lakes? What does irrigation look like? Are they dry farming, or is it kind of just like Wild West? Everybody kind of does their own thing.
So this is the interesting part. So Yerevan is the capital, which is kind of in the northwest. Viat Zor is in the southwest. The Viat Zor is kind of surrounded by the Caucasus Mountain ranges that surround both Armenia and Georgia in a little cradle. So you have some of the highest elevated vineyards in the world. For example, one of the producers that I carry, Kush, owned by Vahi Kushgarian, some of their vineyards are at like 5,000 meters of elevation. And I'm not exactly sure about snowmelt. I think they get some of that, but it's a quite hot region in general. And so if you want to grow grapes that have high acid, you just need to go to high elevation in general. And so I don't think frost is a huge issue for them at the elevations that they're growing at. And I think that some of these varietals classically are thick-skinned and a little more frost-resistant in general. But yeah, like alluding back to what you said, it is a bit of Wild West right now where there's this like big push towards modernization. And it's this weird kind of dynamic between villagers who own a huge amount of the land in this region and winemakers who want to come in and buy it and change the entire landscape. I would imagine the next time, or not the next time, but maybe in 2 or 3 years, when I go back to Viat Zor, it's going to look completely different, because it seemed to me when I was there like it was like essentially untouched land, right? Mm-hmm. It was very rugged. You can't even take buses to any of the vineyards. Mm-hmm. They would bring in cars. They would get like Ladas, like the little Russian cars, and they would take us up these like mountainous paths to the vineyards. And there's no tasting rooms. There's no like on-site wineries. It's very, very wild. But like I said, they're investing heavily in infrastructure there. There's a couple of American Armenians from LA right now that are actually building hotels and whatnot there. Mm-hmm. And so I think that their push towards modernization is going to happen pretty quickly here.
Yeah. Do you feel like that will kind of turn into that classic like tug of war of tradition and modernization, where a lot of people are fighting against it, but a lot of people are fighting for it at the same time? Or do you feel like most of the farmers and most of the landowners are okay with moving forward into the future as long as it's kind of like, I don't want to say financially lucrative, but like if somebody's willing to pay for it, they're like, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So
because it's probably a pain in the ass to farm.
Yeah. So to be honest, I think it's about profitability for the villagers more than anything else. I mean, one of the huge issues that producers have had is that the villagers that tend to these bush vines only care about high yields. They don't care about quality at all. And so they've had to do some things like guarantee pricing despite yields in order to get them to actually tend to the vines a little bit more. And so I think that like I said, as long as these villagers are making money, I don't think that they really care too much about like the changing landscape. Right. I don't think that they necessarily want to be pushed out, but if they can grow with the wine community, I think that it would be good for everyone in the region, right?
Yeah, that's great. That's a good idea. That's a good point too. And maybe that's because of the choppy history that they have with it. It's a little less like we're 14th generation winemakers kind of thing. And it's just like, well, we were growing grapes. We're an agricultural family. We were selling them for brandy. I don't give a fuck. Just buy it by the ton. You know what I mean? Like, that's fascinating.
I think there also is an element though where, at the moment, all of the winemakers and wineries that are kind of expanding in the region, for the most part, are Armenians, right? And there is an element of foreign winemakers coming in, and I think that might be where the problems come up, right? Sure. Like if Armenians are making wine
like
or
tequila,
money for
right?
Armenians, yeah, exactly. But if there's a really great example, and I'm not throwing any shade on these people, but Karas is one of the really famous producers in the north, and they're actually Spanish owned. And there's this kind of sentiment in Armenia that is not really Armenian wine at all. Sure. You know? Yeah. And it's quite good, but it's not stylistically Armenian, and it's definitely not profiting for Armenians in general, you know?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I guess that's a good point that I didn't even really think of is, I mean, and I guess it makes sense, as regions grow in popularity, so does like the interest of larger companies, or maybe not that Karas is a larger company, but a more financially viable business to come in and swoop up some of that land and just produce wine from there and just say like, I have Armenian wine. And you're like, oh, does it taste like who knows what the typical flavor of an Armenian wine is? Yeah. Very few people. You know, I've had every Armenian wine I've ever had has been with you.
Sure.
So, you know, even me, if somebody was like, what does this grape traditionally taste like? I'd be like, I'm going to text Tim under the table.
Yeah. And to be honest, like no one knows.
Right. Yeah.
Like there's an idea, but again, it's like 17 years of ideas. There's not like a lot of that history was oral, you know?
Yeah.
And there's not, I mean, there's recorded accounts obviously, but that only goes so far, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I guess too, maybe we should just do like a quick overview of the grapes and the importance, maybe scale them in the level of importance of Armenia and Georgia, if you want to elaborate on Georgia as well, because I think even for really experienced wine people, like this is really like I don't want to say an Achilles heel, but maybe a blind spot in many people's knowledge. So
yeah, we could talk about some grapes. I mean, Armenia has a lot less grape varietals at the moment planted than Georgia does. Georgia actually has the second most varietals in the world next to Italy. And it can get really crazy really quick. But let me just quickly talk about a couple of Armenian varietals, and we can just brush on a few Georgian things as well.
Sure.
So in Armenia, you have two main red varietals. That's going to be Areni Noir. That's the primary grape that they produce their red wines from. Areni Noir can stylistically be made in a couple of different ways. I think that from like a fruit standpoint, it can have similar notes to maybe like a domestic Pinot Noir, but it can also go darker than that. And so it's a pretty expressive, pretty versatile grape. One thing when I was in Armenia that we were talking about is they haven't really like they haven't really come up with any like standards for their production, and so they have these concepts. They have, reserve, but reserve means something else to every single producer. Right. And so nothing has been standardized.
Sure.
And so oftentimes you'll find that reserve just means that they use new oak, right?
Yeah.
But it might be French new oak, it might be Caucasus new oak, it might be Slovenian. It's kind of all over the place.
Or they just liked it and aged it a little longer or something.
And so that's something that I was talking to producers about when I was there. It's like, guys, we just need to standardize. You need to, have a wine coalition. You need to figure out and delineate, regional barriers, all of that kind of stuff, and just be organized, right? So yes, Areni Noir is the primary grape, in my opinion, that's produced into wines.
Right.
The second grape is Hatenak. Hatenak is a unique varietal. It's a Tentantier varietal. So it's one of the few varietals in the world that the skin and the flesh are both pigmented. And so that's actually what we're going to be tasting later on today. It is...
Let's rip into it.
Yeah, let's go. Cheers.
Thanks. Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think Hatenak has a couple of kind of similarities to other varietals, but I don't often like to compare varietals to varietals.
Sure,
right?
yeah, apples to oranges.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah. But it does show like dark fruit. Obviously, it shows purple flowers,
a little smoked meaty kind of vibe.
A little meatiness. Yeah. You get like some umami richness to it as well. I think it has a ton of aging potential. The interesting thing about this varietal is when I was in Armenia, I tried to find any kind of back vintage. I went to Voshkavaz, the producer, and they were like, "Yeah, we'll give you back vintage." The back vintage that they gave me was 2016.
Right.
That was the oldest in their library that they had. And so we really don't know where this wine is going. I don't think anyone knows. And that was also something that we discussed. I was like, listen, you need to create a system where you're holding back a little more wine,
10% or something.
Yeah, exactly, and like have a proper library built up because. That's going to enable wine professionals when they come to really kind of get a better understanding for where your wines are going long term, right? So that's Hatenak. It's awesome. And then there's a couple of white varietals that they use. I'm just going to talk about one today.
Sure.
Voshkahat is the white varietal. It's a really unique wine. Its only flaw is that if it's not grown at elevation, it has pretty low acid.
Okay.
And so there's a lot of producers, especially like small producers, that are trying to produce these wines. And when I was there, I had all of these really excited people come to me, check my wine out. And the only complaint I had was that like they showed really flabby when they weren't grown at elevation. But when grown at elevation, they have like the soft, velvety feeling of Chenin Blanc, but they have this like unctuous opulence that you find from Chardonnay.
That's cool.
Potentially.
Yeah.
And so it kind of if I were to describe it, it shows somewhere between the two, and if grown really well, it also has a nice mineral backbone to it.
Yeah.
So those are the major varietals, and there's, for the most part, they're producing still wines kind of across the board, except the winery that I alluded to earlier, Kush, which got rated top 10 wines in the world by Forbes this year for their sparkling rosé. and they're making these really awesome traditional method sparklings out of all the grapes we just alluded to.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
They're basically probably the only ones that are making sparkling wine.
There's some
I mean, maybe that
there's
are regularly available.
Yeah, there's some small producers that are doing like pet nat, but he's the only one that's doing like long-term lees aging, and like proper traditional method winemaking. Yeah.
It's interesting to hear you talk about all this, and it's cool, but it's so much for me to download, I feel like, because, in a way, like, I love the like autonomy that every winery can have, and they can kind of do like whatever the fuck they want to do.
Yeah.
But I mean, you're right. Without like not necessarily a regulatory body, but without like a traditional style, or without like a, I don't know, like even if they come up with like their own like DOCG name for a style or something like that, it makes it really hard for consumers to understand what they're gonna get, right?
100%.
I feel like the Armenian noirs that I've had before have like ranged from like kind of funky to like kind of lean to like light and elegant, and they're kind of like all over the place. And it's like when I go to a wine shop, not that I would be seeking out Armenian noir, but then that's when you go for just the big name, because you know that you can rely on it. Not that that's bad, because I guess it's still a small winery relatively. But yeah, it kind of makes it harder for you to trust a region or style. Not trust it, but know that you're going to like it, right?
Yeah, I agree. And also part of the problem is with importing, because all of their borders are closed. The cost of importing Armenian wines is really high. And so this particular wine that we're drinking right here, which is good, is going to be the same price, at least on a restaurant list, as some like, mid-tier Chateauneuf de Pop producers.
Right, yeah.
Right? And so I guess just positioning is quite hard unless you have people are super excited and focused, right? Selling the wines.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like, I think about it a lot when I look at like a catalog, or I look at something like that, or I get a new producer and I go like, I have to sell this. You think about where to put it. And I mean, kind of sometimes the catch-all is to just go like, I'm going to sell it to a tasting menu. Yeah. Because they can put it on a pairing, and like people don't have a choice. They're going to drink it, right? But like that only works for so many wines, right? Like, and so, yeah, it's interesting, but I think without having conversations like this, it seems a little too maybe intimidating. Or when you're thinking about like, oh, I'm going to build this really great like wine list, right? You think about all the regions that you need to touch. Like people just often skim over Armenia because where do you buy it? Know, and then how do I know what it's going to taste like? And then, do I really want to do all the work to find that distributor that carries this wine to buy it and taste it? So
yeah, I agree. But the one thing I will say to counter that point, and this is something that we do at Roman Goat, is something that is a kind of a core belief of mine, is that you can find really great value in all tiers of wine, right? And that's something that I in particular focus on. I think that at every price point, the wines that you have on your list should taste better than their price, right? And that's something that this does. Like as we were talking about before, if you get a 2021 Chateauneuf de Pop at $150 a bottle list price, it's not ready to go.
Right.
You buy this 2018 list price $150 a bottle, it's singing immediately.
It's a great spot.
Yeah. And so I think that is the positioning that wines like this need, is just finding that niche in lists, and then having people just
some champions
for it. Yeah. But really where you get the best success is just getting these wines into people's glasses. And like good wines speak for themselves, and building up that trust with your customer base is paramount. Yeah. I mean, that's what I did initially when we first opened at Roman Goat. I was going to every single table. I was telling them like our story. I was like just really committing to have them take a chance on wines that they don't know. And almost 3 years later, people have fully committed. We're flying every day, and I have plenty of customers who come in regularly, and they just tell me, give me something that you like drinking right now. Yeah. And so that's something that's really rewarding for me, is like you get to go out, you get to spend all of this time studying, researching, tasting wines, and when you're a palate impresses people and aligns with what other people really enjoy, like that's what makes you feel good, and like that's the most rewarding part about what we do, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think also at that $150 price tag, like, I mean, most people are just buying like White Berg because they know White Berg, or they're buying like a classic California Pinot Noir producer because it's like it's something that they can rely on. And I'm not saying that, like, you know, people don't want to drink those wines. People do want to drink those wines, but how often does somebody come in and go like, you know what, I want to take a chance and try something new? Most of the time people are thinking about that price category, and they're just like, if I went out with Bianca and we were out at dinner and we were like, we're going to spend $150 on a bottle of wine, and I was looking at a list, unless somebody walked over to me and was like, I know you want to spend $150 on this, but you should really try this, and could articulately describe it like we've done with these wines, it's you know, intimidating.
There is a good chance, though, if you did buy those wines, that you're going to be pleasantly surprised.
Right.
I will say, you know. And, I mean, that's what I do.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. I think that's something else that I kind of wanted to touch on that I had written down here, was just kind of like, what's it been like, this uphill battle of kind of. So first of all, when you started the program, right, you weren't carrying like German Rieslings. You were carrying like West Coast wines, let's say Oregon, Washington, and California, and then you were carrying effectively Mediterranean, and some French, some Chablis and stuff like that, and you've kind of phased out of all of those things. It's probably something you still deal with every day, but like you're saying, you've kind of cemented your positioning on like having the wines that are outside of the box a little bit for people. Is it still always an uphill battle? Like people walk in and they go like, I want California Sauvignon Blanc, or I want, you know, an oaky, buttery California Chardonnay, and you go like, I don't have it.
At this point, no, it's a downhill battle.
Okay.
We're coasting.
Yeah.
Like, people have fully bought into the concept.
Yeah.
People know what our DNA is at this point, and if they want that style of wine, they either go somewhere else, or I have alternatives that work really well stylistically. I mean, our list is broad, and we have, you know, you can find wines, for example, if you're looking for a California style Chardonnay, I have some really great wines from Croatia, and I have some really great Slovenian wines that fit right in that category, you know? And so I think people are limiting themselves regionally, not stylistically, right? Yeah. And so I think you can find those styles in other regions. I don't think they need to be found here in California. And I think there's people that are doing them just as well as California, if not better. Yeah, I mean, it really depends on, you know, what style you're talking about. If you're talking about, like, you know, big, bold, high alcohol cocktail wines, maybe not. Right. But if you're talking about malactic fermentation, if you're talking about unctuous, opulent wines, we definitely have that covered for you, you know?
Yeah. I think that's great. I think that's so important to be able to kind of like parallel for people, right? Because people often describe, they say the classic saying is they talk dry and drink sweet. Yeah. You know, or like one of the things that's happened before is like, you know, somebody comes in and they go like, I like Cabernet because I like XYZ, and everything they just explained was like Pinot Noir. Yeah. You know? Yeah. I like a light body red with, you know, mild tannin and cherries, and then you're like, that's not Cabernet.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I get people all the time that say, I like Pinot and I like Zinfandel.
Right.
And so I'm like, oh, you like everything.
Yeah,
like,
you like all reds.
Yeah, you're like, you're my easiest customer. Yeah. I'll give you any red wine and you'll probably like it.
Yeah. That's funny. That's hilarious. Yeah, I think, and I think that's the thing. And I think, again, that kind of loops back to what we were talking about before, where it's like, people want to believe, you know, people want somebody to like sell them on the story, sell them on the style, and like kind of like talk about something with passion. Like if 90% of the time, if a server walks over to a table and they say like, you guys, we had this special tonight, we got to try it at lineup, it's really, really good, here's what it is, versus they go, our specials tonight are XYZ, and you go like, I'm good, you know? So I think that's something that you guys have in spades, is the passion and kind of the champion mentality to champion these wines, these regions, and these styles of wines too. So
you mind if I just touch on one thing really
quickly?
No,
please.
So something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I think that the greater wine consumer public needs to think about, and I mean, I'm sure you are, is global warming, right? Global warming has really negatively affected intercontinental regions. Burgundy maybe won't have another great vintage after 2018. Who knows?
It's all frozen or burnt.
Yep. Yeah. And so there are regions, and this is why at Rum and Goat I focus on Mediterranean. Coastal regions historically have grapes that grow better in warmer climates. And with that, also coastal regions, because of specific heat, are less negatively impacted by global warming. And so there's this I guess there's this kind of wine renaissance, in my opinion, going on right now in coastal regions due to the modernization of the wine industry and also just their bounce back from phylloxera epidemic. And they just have the ability to produce better wines than they ever have before, in my opinion, especially reds. And I think it's a really unique time, just kind of across the board in the Mediterranean for these producers, and that's something that I'm super excited about right now.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to touch on, is global warming and its impact on like classic, quote unquote, classic wine styles, right?
Yeah.
It's like that's a wine style that was, you could paint into a picture for how many decades, and it's not anymore. It's just like, during the 76 per year wine tasting, like the wines were different than the wines are now.
Oh yeah, no one was thinking about Bandol back then. No one like that wasn't even in the picture,
right?
Or like Bulgari wasn't even the picture, right?
English sparkling wine, German Pinot Noir.
Yeah.
Like I was on Instagram the other day and I see all these people that are getting together for these massive like German Pinot Noir tastings where they're tasting Pinot from all these German producers at a time, and I'm like, I didn't even realize that many people are making Pinot there. I mean, Spätburgunder's always been a thing, right? But like it's more and more coming to the forefront, I think.
Sure. Or like Sicily is just absolutely blowing up right now, right?
Yeah.
Watch
Sicily's
out.
crushing
It's gonna
it.
get real expensive soon.
Oh yeah. It's already on the incline, you know what I mean? So I think Sardinia, we still have a little chance there. Corsican wines, something that you've had, are important too. So we'll see what the future of the wine is. Southern Italy used to be like the steel.
Yeah.
And a lot of the
still
regions
is in
are.
Campania.
Puglia and, there's still a lot of places where you can get a great wine for not a shitload of money, but those places are fading away.
For sure.
But cool. Yeah, one of the other things that I kind of wanted to touch on that I wrote down here was just kind of, you're somebody that I saw come into this position at Rum and Goat, and I won't assume that you didn't know anything about Georgian and Armenian wine, but most people don't know anything or very little about Georgian and Armenian wine. And you were somebody that came up to speed really quick. I mean, besides potentially a voracious appetite for knowledge or passion, what were other tools that you used? Were you doing flashcards? What books? What are things that you can recommend for people that want to get into or want to understand a little bit more about this region?
Sure. So I don't use conventional approaches to my understanding of wines. I think because how my parents taught me when I was younger, we used to do trips across the country and they'd make me look at these atlases. This was like before Google Maps, and they would make me like find the way from Wisconsin to North Carolina or whatever it may be. And so I learned a lot from topographical maps. And so that's always the starting point for me. I look at the region, I understand the topography, I learn grape varietals, and then once I kind of have that understanding, then I'm going to look at individual producers within each region once I kind of have a better grasp of, each particular region style. So that works really well, but also just talking to people, asking questions. I was going to these wine tasting events at the Georgian consulate, and I learned so much. I mean, it was just networking with producers and talking to them about what they're doing, what they're excited about, and that was a huge help for me getting up to speed in like 2.5 years to really understanding like the greater wine world in the Caucasus. But then traveling there, like alluding back to when I first moved to Napa, like the thing that really helped was to drive the Silverado Trail,
right,
and to go from AVA to AVA, and you understand the differences in topography, the differences in soil type, the differences in mindset in each particular region. And if you understand that, then you kind of have a greater understanding of what they're doing there, right? And so that really helped me when I went to Armenia. And I have yet to go to Georgia, but I talked to a bunch of people that are professionals that work in Georgia, and they have definitely kind of given a piece of that understanding to me. Yeah.
And then something that I guess we glazed over was just kind of like Georgian wines and what that looks like, key wines to look out for. Maybe you could even highlight a couple producers if there's producers you think people should, like a benchmark producer that somebody should look for, a couple benchmark producers.
Yeah, so Georgian wines are complicated. So as I was talking about earlier, Georgian producers make very traditional wines. And so they're making a lot of wines in Qvevri, which are these kind of larger clay vessels that they take full cluster grapes. They do full carbonic maceration. It's long, slow, cold fermentation underground, and then an additional however many months of aging on skins, on stems, all of that. And because of that, many of the producers are quite small. And so it's really hard to like pinpoint, other than like the giant producers that are kind of going against the grain, to pinpoint specific producers that are like leading the charge. I would say I really like Papari Valley. That is one specific producer that does very traditional Qvevri winemaking that I've supported as a brand for quite some time and has been a by the glass option on my list for a while. But the problem with them is that I buy pretty much everything that's imported into the country, and within 4 months I've poured everything out.
Right.
And then I have to, go find the next thing.
Sure.
So it's been a little bit of a challenge to keep consistent wines that I really adore on the list from the Georgian producers. I mean, the thing about Georgia is that the state supports their wine brands a lot more than the Armenian state does at this point.
Right.
And so you have this kind of wine coalition that, brings producers together, facilitates imports, and disseminates into the United States. One of the problems and the limitations that we have here on the West Coast is that the largest Georgian population, and same with Armenian population, is in New York. And so we're kind of like the tertiary landing spot.
Sure.
Wines get imported into New York, they go down to Los Angeles, and then we're kind of the third stop.
Yeah.
And something that I've been working on in the last couple of years is to convince them to just direct import in to the Bay Area. And ways that I can do that is I can guarantee pallet buys,
sure,
or I can commit long term to a specific one in my program,
90
or whatever it may
180
be.
days or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So that's been the big limitation in terms of varietals. Saperavi is the primary red varietal that they grow. It's actually similar to the Hatanak. They're actually cousins. Georgia and Armenia touch each other.
Right.
There's a lot of crossover, right?
Yeah.
But Saperavi is another Tintantier varietal, dark expressions. I mean, stylistically, it's way different because it's these long-term, on skin, on stem ferments where you get a lot more woodiness out of it than you often find in these varietals or these styles from Armenia. Unless they're doing oak aging, and then Kisi is going to be the other main varietals, and Ricasatelli for whites. So you have Kisi and Ricasatelli, and they mostly make those into amber wines, which is what they call orange wines in Georgia and Armenia.
And those are all effectively aged in Qvevri.
Yes, it's complicated. So.
What's the tree wine?
The tree wine. Yeah. So yes, a lot of them are fermented and aged in Qvevri, but Qvevri wine production is quite expensive and kind of labor intensive. So slow, and often they'll start their lives in Qvevri and then they'll finish them off in steel later on, right?
Okay.
And so like the less traditional producers are going to do more steel than Qvevri, right? Yeah.
And then what's the tree wine? I really want you to elaborate on the tree wine.
I'm gonna forget the name of this producer now because my Georgian is horrible. But there's this. It's Ojaleshi is the varietal. It's a wine made in northern Georgia, and they have these large, I guess, lime trees that they like hollow out the trunks. And then they do all of their fermentation inside of the trunk of this tree. It's a very like old traditional style of winemaking in Georgia. Like one of the oldest, actually. I think it probably dates all the way back to like 6,000 BCE. Like, way back in the day, like 8,000 years of tree wine production.
Tree wines.
It's really cool. No, I mean stylistically, have you had it before?
Yeah. When it came in,
it tastes like if you made a baked apple pie and took all the sugar out of it. It's really awesome.
Yeah, it was really cool. And I think like, trying the wines with you, over the years that I've called on you, I love coming and showing you wine, but I also love when people are excited and share wine with me. And it's been really eye-opening, but that was one of the ones that I was like, I had heard of Quivery. I've heard of like, clay amphoras in the ground and all this stuff. I was like, cool. But then it was like tree trunk aged wine. Like, what the fuck is this? Like Keebler elves coming out hammered as shit, lit.
So Madeline Puck came in a couple of months ago. She's the founder of Wine Folly, and that's actually the wine that we started them off with.
Oh, that's awesome. That's so cool.
And they thought it was really cool.
Yeah, that's great.
It's not like, the most refined wine in the world, but it's unique and interesting and fun to check out,
Well, it's great to see how refined these wines have gotten over time, right? Because you think about like people, Bianca used to represent this great Greek importer, Diamond Imports, and there was a lot of awesome wine coming in from Greece. And like one of the things that she would deal with all the time, and that the accounts would deal with, like let's say Estiatori Ornos or Kokari, is the classic, I'm forgetting it, it's called like not Renier. It's called, I can't remember what it is, but there's this wine that they used to age, and they would take like tree sap, and they would Racine. It's there. I'm gonna get it before the end of the episode, maybe. And they would like age it with like a resin cap, and then they would drink the wine, and the wine would be like fucking piney. So like everybody that would come in would go like, Greek wine, like I've had Greek wine, I don't really like it. And they go, have you had this? And everybody would go, yes. Because when they go to Greece, that's what they would get, right? And they'd go like, yeah. And they go like, that's like 10% of all of the wine that's produced is that, right? Like just because you've had one or two things in Greece, you can't box everything in. Like we're talking about with these awesome Georgian and Armenian wines, right? So it's great to see the slow process of people opening their eyes and hearts and minds to these wines,
And if you want to do quote unquote natural wine, I mean, this is the way you want to do it,
right?
The Georgians do it really the only way that I personally enjoy. They do cold fermentation, and when you're doing spontaneous fermentation, you need to have some sort of control.
A little bit of control.
And the only way you can control it is by lowering the temperature of the ferment, right? And that oftentimes will eliminate Brett, because Brett doesn't ferment very well in lower temperatures. And so you'll often have the intended yeast from the vineyard be what's fermented into the wine rather than a yeast that you're not necessarily looking for, right?
Are they doing that with cold jacket, or is that just part of
they dig a hole? And
that's part of the subterranean.
Yeah, that's part of the subterranean element. So
cool.
Yeah, they dig a hole, and I mean the large vessel is fully submerged under the soil, right? Yeah, and they're just doing like minimal cap management just to ensure that they're not getting too much weirdness in the batch.
What are some of the classic things that you ate when you went to Armenia that were like? Did they have like, this is the classic pairing for this wine, or was it just kind of like all similar cuisine that was just always kind of served?
Yeah, so cuisine is interesting in Armenia because of all of the occupations that they've had. There's a huge amount of influence from Middle Eastern cuisine.
I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, and so like it's hard to really like pin down what traditional Armenian food is, except for some specific categories. So the first day we went there, we were staying at this hotel, and they had like this wonderful continental breakfast because they don't really import anything into Armenia, so everything is local fresh produce,
That's awesome.
right? And local fresh charcuterie, all of that. And so the first day we went and we ate at the hotel continental breakfast. We then went out to lunch and we started touring wineries. The tour guide told us every winery we were going to, okay, so it's only going to be cheese and crackers. Inevitably, we would show up, and their mother would have been cooking for like 3 days in preparation for us being there, right?
I love that.
And like 20 minutes after a full meal, they're expecting you to sit down and have another full meal, and she's sitting there looking at you, being angry the entire time that these Americans show up.
Fucking Americans
they're,
aren't
they're,
eating.
they're not eating the food. But so a mainstay of traditional Armenian food is something called horovats. Horovats is a type of Armenian barbecue that's served with lavash. It's the flatbread that they make in these like large clay ovens that they like cook the bread on the side of these
Slap
these
it
fire
inside on
clay
the side.
ovens.
Yeah.
Exactly. And horovats is normally, I think, pork barbecue that's like on these swords, you know?
Oh, yeah.
They have like these huge skewer swords, and the barbecue itself, they actually use they use like grape stems to barbecue.
Wow.
And so we would show up, and everywhere it was horovats. We'd show up, and the first place we went to, they had it rolling. We were like, okay, it was in this beautiful little back garden they had behind the winery, and they gave us little like sandwiches of lavash. And like, oh, this is what we're eating. And then they took us back into the tasting room, and there was the largest spread of food you've ever seen in your entire life, right? And so we like had already eaten lunch, eaten a ton of horovats, and then it was like locally made cheeses, produce, herbs, a bunch of like really great charcuterie, and they had promised us that we were going to taste 6 wines. We ended up tasting like 30 wines from like their second label and their cousin's label.
Their friends. And
and then sat down for like a 3-hour meal.
Yeah.
And then after that, we went to another winery and just like did it all over again, you know? So it was a great experience. They do the horovats, and then I guess in the south they have a lot of rivers, and so they do a lot of fish as well.
Oh, cool.
So similar style barbecue fish with fresh vegetables, cheeses, charcuterie, and herbs, right?
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
That sounds like my dream.
Yeah.
It was like that when we went to Spain. It was like we would like go, and there'd be more food than they're going to put out the little bread and meat. And you'd go like, okay. And then they'd put out like plates and plates and plates of chorizo, and you're just like eating and eating and eating. And then you'd sit down and they'd have like a bunch of food, and you're just like, I guess we're doing this. You know?
There were multiple times where we would look at each other as Americans with this desperate look in our eye and be like, what are we doing?
Are you going to eat some? If you eat it, I have to eat it. Like, can you not? Yeah. I was when I was in Spain, I was next to Debbie Zacharias from Ferry Plaza, and like the first night we sat next to each other, and she was like, she's a light eater, and she wouldn't finish it, and she'd go, do you want this? And I go, okay. And then I would eat it, and then like after the 4th day, I was like, I can't sit next to you anymore. I can't keep finishing your meals. Like, you know, she completely understood, obviously, but I was just like, this is awesome. She goes, you're gonna be my partner for the rest of the trip. I was like, great.
Yeah.
And then at day 4, I was just like, I can't. I'm so sorry. I got to tap.
Yeah, the biggest challenge is staying skinny in our industry.
Oof,
you know?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I struggle with it all the time. I wouldn't know because I can't stay skinny.
Yeah.
I'm trying constantly. Cool. Let's see. Is there something else that you want to talk about in particular? Do you want to give any plugs to anybody?
Yeah, I mean, so I've got a couple of projects coming up here.
Yeah.
They're all kind of like secret projects right now, but I'm working on another wine bar in San Francisco that should be open in the next hopefully 6 months, and then I'm also going to be starting a small import company as well, mainly to import into the wine bar that
Awesome.
I'm going to be opening. My kind of motivation has been that with all of the consolidation that's been going on in the distribution side of things, a lot of smaller, unique producers have kind of pulled out of the market, and I see a lot of potential in working with them and, you know, being able to kind of circumnavigate the tariffs by circumnavigating the like multiple levels of distribution.
Right.
And bringing, again, for me, everything is about bringing value to the consumer and just having unique, fun wines. And I think that there's a lot out there that just isn't in market, and I always want to explore and find new things. And we're in this to be excited and to be inspired. And the way we do that is not going with the kind of conventional techniques and like going out and searching the world and finding our own things. I mean, I often find inspiration from Kermit Lynch. I mean, it was what he did early on in his career. He started his company out of a garage in Berkeley, essentially, and he was just excited about wine, and he went and traveled and met producers. And I mean, I'm not saying that I'm going to replicate Kermit Lynch, but like I do
maybe in 50 years.
Maybe in 50 years, but I do draw inspiration from what he did.
Right.
And I don't think there's any reason not to go out and do that. And I think there's this feeling that like the wine world has been fully tapped into, and that's just not the case. There's basically infinite producers out there, and there's always going to be someone that's passionate, and there's always going to be someone that's dedicated to their craft that has not been exposed to the wine public in here in California or in the United States in general. And so that's definitely something that I want to work on and be part of.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I see more and more there's these like Japanese wines that keep cropping up, and I see like Somm's getting really excited about it, and I'm like, this is the next wave.
Yeah.
The Chinese have been making it. I remember when I worked for Glazers back in the day, we had one Chinese wine in the book, and it was Chateau Ao Yun from Shangri-La. Yeah. And we had like 12 bottles, and I tried to sell it to this account, and they told me like, you can't sell it. I was like, why? And they were like, well, because it has to be a pre-vetted account. I'm like, these bottles have been in inventory for 2 fucking years.
Yeah, that's
it's
insane.
A $250 bottle of like Chinese cab. If my account wants to buy some, let them buy it, But that was the unfortunate part, is like the gatekeepiness that came along with it. So I'm hoping that we are not dealing with the same thing in the coming years of deeper Eastern European wines and Asian wines. We should also talk more specifically on the wine that you brought.
Yep.
We could talk more on, where did we put it?
I got it right here.
Oh, okay, perfect. In my little blind spot. Yeah, maybe. So you mentioned the grape already, but is this one of the producers that you were talking about as well?
Yeah. So this is Voshkevaz Hatanak.
Take another little splash.
Yeah, of course. Voshkevaz is, I would say, the most traditional producer. And also the producer that had the most money after the USSR disbanded.
Thank you.
In order to, kind of kickstart the industry. And the thing that Voshkevaz is doing that kind of no one else has been able to do kind of on a larger scale is they're making these Karasi wines. So Karasi is the traditional clay vessel that they would age in Armenia, but the unfortunate thing is that the technology to make Karasi was lost during the Ottoman occupation, and so they no longer know how to make these clay vessels. They don't know where the clay came from. They don't know how they fired them, and so all of these clay vessels were either destroyed by the Ottomans, or villagers built structures around them in order to hide them,
to enclose them,
them, and so post USSR disbandment, Voshkevaz went around the country collecting as many of these vessels as they could find. The problem is that many of them are 200-year-old, and the only materials they have to make buildings out of in Armenia are stone structures. So they had to completely disassemble stone structures and then try to pull these really fragile
you have
clay
one of these?
vessels.
I want to buy it. Yeah. Okay, great. I'm going to tear your house down, and then I'll build it back. Yeah.
Yeah, and so they have a collection, I think, of about 40 of these clay vessels, anywhere from like 250 to 800 mil.
Yeah.
Like really small to really large,
right.
And they have multiple lines, but this particular wine is their Karasi collection, and so this is fully fermented in Karasi and this underground basement structure that they have at the winery in Voshkevaz. And then it does see some time on neutral oak for kind of long-term aging. But yeah, I think it's probably the best producer, in my opinion, in Armenia, and the most traditional producer in Armenia. They also have a really awesome collection of like 200 to 400-year-old bush vine in multiple different regions.
Wow.
I actually just was able to work out with Storica, the importer of this wine, to direct import to me their rosé that they produce.
Cool.
And so I think that Roman Goat and maybe one account in New York are the only people in the entire country that have this rosé, and it's absolutely killer.
It'll be from the same grape.
Same grapes. No, so it's made with Armenian Noir.
Oh, okay.
But same producer.
I see.
And there's really not a ton of rosé made in Armenia,
right?
Because it has to be high elevation,
right?
Old vine, high acid, and they make the best expression. When I was there, it was strawberry season, which is like a huge thing in Armenia, and they served the rosé with strawberries, and it was like one of the best experiences of my life.
Cool.
It was like the best organic, non-GMO strawberries you've ever had, with like wine that tastes like strawberries.
Right.
It was like the perfect pairing.
That's so cool.
Yeah,
I love that. And that is it something that you're going to be able to pour by the glass, or
I'm pouring it by the glass. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah,
and I'm also working on renegotiating the pricing on this wine, hopefully eventually to get it poured by the glass.
That'd
right
be
now
awesome.
It's far too expensive, but everything can be renegotiated.
Sure. Yeah. With enough elbow grease in it as possible. Yeah. I mean, it's like you were saying, to get some of these wines out of the country is challenging, and then to get them here and then resell them after all the chain of distribution. It just ticks the price up a little bit more and a little bit more. But the second you're able to pour this stuff by the glass, like, again, or have like $100 bottle of wine, that's a lot easier to sell than a $200 bottle of wine, right? But I think that's one of the beautiful things about what Roman Goat's doing and what you're doing with the program there is you're really committed to helping give these wines and these regions a platform and championing these like lesser known regions. So I'm appreciative of that.
Thank you.
What do you think about the white wine?
I think, all right,
it's not always blindable.
Okay.
So I'm not. You don't have to guess it. I'm gonna just I'll always give that disclaimer. It's a more like kind of a do you like it, do you not like it kind of question.
I like it. I think it shows like really nice kind of yellow apple notes. It's really smooth. Has nice mouthfeel. I was thinking initially that it was reminding me of maybe Friulano or something like that from Friuli, or maybe Arenis, something like that. But I could be completely wrong.
No, it's so impossible to guess these wines. Sometimes people have nailed it. Sometimes people are kind of like off, and that's okay because it's not always a blindable wine. I wanted to get something that I thought kind of tied together two thoughts. But anyways, this is a Verdelho. And I was thinking it was Verdejo, but it's not. It's Verdelho. I threw it in the fridge and didn't think anything of it. But traditionally a Portuguese wine from the Isle of Madeira. And then this actually comes from Placer County in the Sierra foothills.
Yeah.
So it was domestic Verdelho that I was just like, kind of cool, kind of fun. And
I think it's great. I think it's a wine that if it was any lower acid would just fall flat. And I think it's just like right where you want it to be.
Yeah. It's funny because like when I tried it upon corvining it, earlier at the house, and I just tried it right out of the bottle, I was like, fuck, the alcohol's ripping, right? But after it opens for a little while, it's fun. I mean, they say like, should you decant white wines? This benefited from the air, I think.
I mean,
it's like 150 case production, so it's kind
like
of
14.1.
Yeah.
So I think that any wine with high alcohol content can be good as long as it's well integrated.
Right.
And this is a really good example of that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, cool. I wanted to expose you to something. I was thinking like Iberian Peninsula and something that's so far out of the box that it's something that I was hoping you'd never had domestic Verdelho.
No,
but
I definitely have not.
Good.
Yeah.
And mission accomplished.
That's awesome.
So cool. Well, let's see. Other than that, we're kind of to the phase where I ask if you have any statements that you'd like to make, any advice that you'd like to give to people, just maybe in their wine journey, their wine career, or kind of like at all.
Yeah.
And this is your moment to say whatever you want to say effectively.
Yeah, I think my biggest advice to people, whether they be just consumers or people who want to be wine professionals, is just be curious and ask questions. You know what I mean? Like, I am humbled every day working in the wine industry. You know, I've studied wine for 10 plus years, and I run into a wine every single day that I haven't had before.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really awesome and unique. And experiences that I have all the time with consumers is that they have been somewhere that I've never been before. They've had an experience that I've never had before. And you can learn from people who are way below your level.
Right.
And like, never feel like you're above anyone working in the wine industry, because you're really not. And like, there's infinite information out there, and like, that's our job, is to collect all of that and like disseminate it to people, and just have fun and enjoy it, and like explore the greater world, and don't limit yourself. I often find that both customers and wine professionals spend so much time just limiting themselves in their interests, in their perspective of what's good, in their perspective of styles. And I think that, you know, opening up your mind and being humble is kind of the best way to do it.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I mean, it kind of is like the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Like, you go up to the Mount of Stupidity, and then you go to the Valley of Despair, when you realize, like, I'm never going to know everything. And then you just get okay with not knowing everything, and you just learn to enjoy the process, and then you kind of like taper into further knowledge after that. No, I think that's really well said, and that's not something that we talk about enough, is just kind of like keeping the curiosity, keeping the passion, keeping the kind of desire to be like a student alive. So
also, if you're a customer, ask your wine professional for advice, please. That's all we want to do. Is we want to find you something that you really like, you know? And I often find that people are just like, we'll just order randomly, and I'll come up and like, do you have any questions, or do you want any advice? And they'll be like, no, I'm good. And then they'll get a wine that they hate. And I'm like, why did you do that? I could have found an awesome wine in the price point that you're looking for that you would absolutely love. Just have a 10-second conversation. You know? And you're going to have a way better time if you do that.
Yeah, I think that's also a little bit on us, and I won't elaborate too long, but I think that's a little bit on us. And like, you're creating this space where you almost box them into this position of having to ask. And I think that's cool. But like, it's also like, wine just has to be more approachable. And I think it's through conversations like this and mediums like this and programs like yours that we're allowing the opportunity for people to have these conversations and not feel intimidated. Like, I don't feel intimidated asking about Armenian wine at all, because I'm not supposed to know anything, because nobody else knows shit, right?
No one's supposed to know anything unless you study it. Come
exactly.
on.
So I think that's beautiful. And I hope that people come and visit Roaming Goat, and whether they be wine professionals or not, and they explore these regions and get to connect with these amazing people that are over there, and one day maybe I'll visit them. But you know, I gotta study a lot more.
Yeah, we'll make it happen.
Cool. All right,
Awesome.
Tim.
Yeah.
Well,
Hey.
it's been a pleasure.
Yeah,
Cheers.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you.